Welcome, everyone, to a very special edition of our Must See Monday series. We are honored to have Eric Newton with us, Senior Advisor to the President of the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, giving a talk on the history of the future of news, what 1767 tells us about 2110. And let me, if I could, just take a moment to tell you a little bit about Mr. Newton's rich career in journalism, which started off on the West Coast. Eric was the managing editor of the award-winning Oakland Tribune for a decade before moving to the Newseum, where he was the founding managing editor of the Newseum in Washington, D.C., and for the past 10 years has been in Miami at the Knight Foundation as vice president for journalism initiatives. I will tell you that I've had the pleasure of knowing Mr. Newton for many years now. There is no one that I am aware of who has had more of an impact on journalism and where journalism is going than Mr. Newton and the Knight Foundation. His impact here at the Cronkite School is very clear through programs such as the Carnegie Knight News 21 initiative, the Knight Center for Digital Media Entrepreneurship, along with a number of other Knight Foundation initiatives. Throughout journalism, Mr. Newton has guided some $300 million in grants worldwide to advance journalism. But more importantly, Mr. Newton is a true thought leader in journalism and the future of journalism and where we're going. And tonight, he's going to pull his 3 decades of experiences as a leading newspaper editor, as the founder of the Newseum, and his work at the Knight Foundation for his discussion, which will take us back to the past and into the future. So with that, it is an honor to introduce to you Eric Newton.
Thank you. So, students of the Cronkite School, do you have any idea how lucky you are? Here you are doing award-winning journalism in one of, if not the, hottest journalism school in America. You're demonstrating, there we go. You're demonstrating the top students and top professionals working together can do amazing national stories in our News 21 project, in the Washington Post and many other national outlets. And this is the only school in America that is a 2-time winner of the Knight News Challenge for Media Innovation. And you have a dean. Thank you for that kind introduction, Chris. You have a dean who seems to have superhuman powers. So be proud. Give yourselves a hand. Now don't blow it. Tonight I'd like to try something different. Using a new theory about media history, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what news might be like in the next 100 years. And here are some points to keep in mind. Point number 1, we're in a profoundly new age of human communication, the digital age. No one really knows how it's going to come out. Point number 2, science fiction seems to be doing a better job of bridging history and prophecy than the experts are. Point number 3, there are undiscovered patterns in the history of news. And one of those is that every American generation grows up with a different form of media in ascendance. And point 4 is another pattern from the history of news. People in their 20s play key roles in inventing news media. Always have. So a little reminder, when we're talking tonight about media, that includes especially the use of media for quality journalism. And let's define journalism excellence tonight as the fair, accurate, contextual search for truth that provides citizens with the independent news and information they need to know to run their communities and their lives. So if you're ready for some time travel, we can get started. And here we go. I hope. Okay. Point number one, the digital age is a new age. There are some others on this slide. The visual age of communication, the age of language, and the age of mass media. So I've got 4 great ages in the history of communication. That's it. Now, in the beginning, proto-humans wandered the earth. We don't know when the first news story was. We can guess that the first news story probably went something like this. Ah! You know, you point to the animal that's about to eat your family. Ah! You repeat the headline, and there you are, news of danger. Now, after a very long time, language evolved, making that kind of news story a little easier to do. Once you can talk, you can figure out writing. And it was quite a while before the next big change in news came along. The creation of mass media, which I put at 1450 with the invention of metal movable type. Because the printing of books, the first real mass media, was the beginning of all mass media to follow, newspapers, radio, TV, and they're really all derivative of the same one-way assembly line push of news. Today we call all of those media legacy media, so we lump them all together. Now, the World Wide Web went online in 1991. Doesn't seem like 20 years ago. So I'd say this starts the digital age. And today, mass media doesn't flow only from these one-way assembly line industrial age mechanisms. The electrons of news make up a global network. We have one-to-one, one-to-some, one-to-many, many-to-many, all kinds of forms of communication like a giant or organic ecosystem. 5 billion humans with cell phones, all of them capable of acts of journalism. The sum total of human knowledge, ever more available, doubling and doubling and doubling. So truly a new age. We have 1 million years of visual news and then suddenly language and everything else. So this graph looks sort of like the kind of exponential graph that you're going to see if you look at the creation of new IP addresses or the spread of the internet generally. You'd think that all of this information would make us good at predicting the future. Not so. This picture I'm showing you now is a drawing that was in Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, December 31st, 1899. It is a prediction of what New York's going to look like in the year 1999, which was 100 years ahead. So let's take a look at what we've got here. Tall buildings, big ships, airships. But if you look a little more closely, you see that the buildings are stone buildings, the ships are steamships, and the airships are dirigibles. No glass skyscrapers, no jet planes, and no nuclear submarines. So what went wrong? Well, we tend to use what we know to guess at what's going to come next. This is the linear march of time, very popular in the industrial era. But time, it turns out, is more complicated than that. Here's a graphic that my son William, who's a senior at the University of Florida, drew. He did it to explain the evolution of an idea, but to me it also shows the flow of the sum total of ideas, the flow of history. It's a kind of a cyclone with cycles and forward movement and unleashing tremendous force. And we get the future wrong because we don't see the cyclone of things that are happening around us. Point 2, science fiction writers are dreaming their way to futures the rest of us can't seem to calculate. Here we have Jules Verne saying 100 years before it happened that the rocket projectile will leave Florida, go to the moon, and splash down in the ocean. Not bad. Here we have geostationary satellites, which make the digital age possible. The satellites are in something called Clark orbits. Why Clark orbits? Because Arthur C. Clarke, a science fiction writer, conjured geostationary satellites in 1945 in a magazine article, 12 years before Sputnik was launched. Later, Arthur C. Clarke would say, he invented the most commercially viable communications idea of the 20th century, and for that was paid the regular freelance fee of $35. Or how about Skype from the Jetsons? Or maybe the cell phone from the TV series Star Trek. And you know, you laugh, but the fellow who actually invented the cell phone said he got the idea from Star Trek. No kidding. And then there's the iPad in the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey. The average American thinks this is amusing and entertaining and a bit crazy. So the first principle when predicting the future is to think crazy. Not just out of the box crazy, but off the planet crazy. Now, since one must be unconventional to be even close to being right, here's what I did. I took 2 unconventional best-selling books that have opposite views of time, mashed them up with everything that I knew from doing the content at the museum, and that's what you're going to hear about tonight. The books are The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe, and The Singularity is Near by Ray Kurzweil. The one says that there are cycles in human history that seem to be locked in since the Renaissance, and that have to do with ancient human rhythms. And this one says humans are going to transcend biology. Talk about that. Now, I immediately noticed something. Point 3. Every American generation has grown up with a different form of media in ascendance. We talked today about how it's a time of great continuous change, and boy, for the first time, things are changing all the time. No, not so. Every American generation since the American Revolution has come of age with a different form of media on the rise. Now, Strauss and Howe list 12 generations of Americans born since the Revolution, and this is where we get the 1767 from the title of this talk. That's the birth year for what's called the Compromise generation. It's the one born actually during the Revolution. And what form of media was on the rise? The pamphlet. Thomas Paine's Common Sense was a runaway bestseller. Now, there were colonial newspapers, but the pamphlet was peaking. There were an estimated 120,000 copies of Common Sense printed. It wasn't until the next generation that the colonial newspapers actually exploded. Why? Well, you had a new country, you had the First Amendment, but you also had postal roads, a huge expansion of postal roads and post offices, a gigantic exponential expansion, subsidized delivery for the weekly newspapers, and they just went nuts. The next generation, a new form of media rose up, populist daily newspapers called the penny press, not just for the elites, but for everybody. And then after that, the Associated Press and the Telegraph. And there are many complicated reasons why each of these media forms exploded and really grew rapidly during that time frame. Nevertheless, it's a pattern. Every generation, a new form of media, constantly changing. So imagine people sitting around a century ago, and one person says to another, you know, our kid has never known a world without daily newspapers. Our kid is a daily newspaper native. He doesn't know what it's like to wait for news to come from some faraway place. He's used to getting the news every single day. No wonder this kid is so impatient. His attention span is shot. Does this sound familiar? So the fourth turning had a very big pattern of its own to reveal. Get this, about every 80 years since the Renaissance, but today we're looking at the American Revolution, about every 80 years there's been a crisis, every 4 generations, and about every 80 years there's been a great awakening. Now Strauss and Howe trace this all the way back. They say it's a social cycle that humans have created because of the interplay of generational archetypes, and it goes all the way back to our evolution as a species and the 4 seasons. Well, maybe. But regardless of the reasons, it's there. It's there throughout American history. So we have a Civil War, but 47 years before that, we have the American Revolution. And 80 years after the Civil War, we have World War II. Now you take that, and on top of that, you have each generation getting its new form of media. You have, in this slide, illustrated magazines were the killer app of their time. You could see pictures of people in Civil War battles. The major metropolitan newspapers, huge. Mass circulated photographs, and then radio and newsreels. And by the end of these 4 generations, you can read, and see, and hear, and watch the news. So let's put these patterns into our future predictions. Will they continue? Well, they seem to be. Even as we move into Ray Kurzweil's explosion of information technologies in the digital age. Have you seen anything like this in a history book? Is this starting to get at least a little crazy? I hope so. It's almost as though there's a basic human need to, not just to know, but to tell. There are many voices struggling to be heard, finding new ways to be heard every generation. We use that line in the museum. So on this slide, we see the baby boomers. That includes me. We grew up when TV was young. When TV came of age, so did we. And we became lifelong consumers of and shapers of TV. So it's important to look not at when things are invented, but when they became ubiquitous, when they really exponentially increased. When a medium pops, that's when it shapes us and we shape it. So really it's not surprising to see the role of Gen Xers shaping the web, or of many of you millennials here today shaping the emergence of mobile and social media. Those will be your media forms, and you digital natives will always have a special affinity toward them. We see in this slide in the 1960s, there's the great awakening, the consciousness expansion. 80 years after what was called the Third Great Awakening. And we see the crisis cycle continuing with 9/11, the global recession, and World War 3.0 coming 80 years after World War II. So what's World War 3.0? It's the war in cyberspace, the war of the digital age, one that already may have begun. Last year, our government declared that cyberspace is an official arena of war. There's an estimated 100 countries that already have cyber armies. And every day, there are an undisclosed number of cyber attacks, many of the ones on the United States coming from China, North Korea, and Iran and other countries. So if the cycle of crisis holds, we get World War 3.0. We may already have it. The first invisible war of the digital age. And it remakes the world. And you are here right in the middle of it. The millennials will be the ones who rise up to be the heroes of World War 3.0. This might not be all bad. This country does tend to win wars, and wars can cause unity, new institutions, and societies emerging stronger than they were before. So how are we doing? Are we crazy yet? So what's coming with media? The Pew Research says that in the near term, news media is becoming more personal, more portable, and more participatory. And that sounds about right to me. But there's more. How about wearable media? Why carry a phone when you can have it all in your watch? Dick Tracy will be hip again. Once we combine generational media, historical cycles, and exploding technology, we're ready to look at the coming century. Remember, we do not want brick buildings, steamships, or dirigibles. We want something really different. So we're off. First comes intelligent media during your lifetimes. This means the end of the printed, home-delivered, paid circulation, daily newspaper. Print won't die, but that particular animal I just described is already well on the way out. If you extrapolate the household penetration rates of that particular kind of media, they have been in a declining straight line grid since World War II. And it goes to zero in April of 2040. So not all newspapers will be gone. Maybe there will be Sunday papers. Maybe they will be free. Maybe they won't be home delivered. But the particular thing that many of my generation and my father's generation have come to know, this thing called the printed, home-delivered, paid circulation daily newspaper, cannot possibly continue. By then, all media will be smart. You'll carry on conversations with computers in any language, asking them questions, asking them to do your research. News bots, news drones, robot scribes. In time, you'll be able to experience any event anywhere on the planet as though you were there, if a news bot is there. A 360-degree news bot can be in a place and stream thousands of feeds simultaneously. So you can be sitting in a virtual room or with goggles and look up, down, left, right, and it would be just like being there. If you want to see the State of the Union address or the World Cup or anything, all we have to do is pop a news bot down there, and then you can watch it just like you're there. After World War 3.0, we'll be done fooling around, and free governments will have something called universal data transparency. Every piece of public information will be public from the moment it enters a government computer. You'll be able to send your research bot out there and find all the city managers in America making $800,000 a year for running tiny little towns like Bell, California. Everything will be available to you all the time, no matter where you are, and all the words we now use, like radio and television, to describe legacy media will be gone. And so will a lot of those media. People will start experimenting with media implants. And as proof of all of this, I have the historical documents, robotics, bionics, artificial intelligence. It's all been in sci-fi before. What's next? Biomedia, implants, and augmented reality for everyone. No matter where you go, you can call up anything you would want to know about that place. There'll be an awful lot of people walking around appearing to be talking to themselves, kind of like now with cell phones, except without the phones. They'll be talking to their media implants. We'll become more and more indistinguishable from machines. Why? Because we'll want nanotechnology to eliminate our genetic flaws. We'll want seamless bionics to have fully functional replacement limbs. We'll want implants to correct brain damage. That's Kurzweil's theory. You'll be able to save your entire life experience in the digital cloud. How you thought, what you did, things you saw and heard and watched, things you wrote, your portfolios, and what you made of all of it. You'll be able to pass this life experience along to your children or to anyone. People will be able to ask you questions after you're dead. Your digital memory will answer. And then the machines will become self-aware. Now, it's been 80 years by this time since the 1960s, and it's time for another good awakening. The singularity is kind of a point of no return, and that's what Kurzweil says is going to happen in the middle of this century. The unbelievable result of a quite believable exponential increase in technological power. So that's when things really start to get interesting. I call it the generation of hypermedia. Machines keep creating more intelligent machines at an exponential rate, and things that seem impossible suddenly start to get solved. The code is cracked, and information can be downloaded into your brain. Like Neo in The Matrix. You can learn Kung Fu or anything else in 10 seconds. Like the movie Avatar. The whole environment begins to come alive, and you can communicate with it in basic ways. So what is news at this point? News is whatever we want to know at any given moment. And it creates a quantum leap in our ability to solve problems or create problems. And then finally, omnimedia. We're the gods we've always imagined. We know everything, can do anything, can read thoughts, project commands, move objects, teleport them, change them. It's really not that great a leap. If you can get information into your head, you can get it out. But in the end, we're just human enough to follow the pattern of crisis every 80 years. And this last crisis is the one for our own survival. World War 4.0. Humans against a non-human foe. Maybe it's the machines or the nanobots or the Earth itself. But it's a war, our first war, against non-humans. It's scary enough to want to be gone when it happens, which of course I will be, but not some of you, or maybe not all of you. You watch the young people, you'll watch your children and grandchildren and their children either prevail or rebuild, and in the end, we'll know what happened. You have to admit, it's going to be a great story. So there you are, 1767 to 2100. Now, can we agree at this point we have crossed over the line? Even though there are about 7 billion reasons why this may not happen or happen this fast, it's definitely crazy. So it might happen. I hope this gives you something to think about, and it makes you agree that today we're just scratching the surface of the digital age. When I count to 3, you'll be back in Arizona at the Monday lecture. 3, 2, 1. Now, what does this have to do with you? Well, to get to this future, someone's got to shape it. That gets to be you. So is this too much for 20-somethings to handle? I don't think so. What about this young person? When he died, someone tweeted, I mean Steve Jobs. When he died, someone tweeted, born to unwed parents, put up for adoption, dropped out of school, changed the world. What's your excuse? Some of your elders won't believe you're doing what you say you're doing. That's happened before. This is a popular image circulating around cyberspace. Hardly anyone invested heavily in this motley crew, and hardly anyone got to be billionaires. Here are some other folks, clockwise: Ben Franklin, Horace Greeley, Pulitzer, Hearst, a guy named Lord Northcliffe, inventor of the tabloid, Ida B. Wells, David Sarnoff of radio, and good old Philo T. Farnsworth, who got the idea of TV when he's plowing a field as a teenager and said, I can do this with electrons. There's a statue of Philo in the next room here, but he's not a teenager. In fact, it's very difficult to get photographs of some of these folks when they were really inventing the things that they're famous for today, which they were doing in their teens and 20s. Just like Einstein wrote his first and greatest papers at his youngest age. So, I mean, it's something to think about. There are certainly plenty of jobs for a journalism and mass communications major to do, getting ready for these kinds of futures. You can learn truthful storytelling in all media. You can master computer-assisted reporting and design. Watch a lot more science fiction. That's my favorite one. Fool around with new digital tools every day. Rewrite the codes of ethics, because new tools make new rules. And the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics hasn't been revised since the 90s. Something's happened since the 90s. It really needs some work. You can make friends with people who speak tech, even if you don't code yourself. Help invent new story forms. You could develop sources for covering World War 3.0, just in case. Learn about media law. It's all being rewritten for the digital age. Do new business models, ditto. and new engagement techniques to deal with the people we used to call the audience. Or you could just teach digital and media fluency to everyone. You know it, and most people still don't. Last year I was stunned to see a survey of journalism and mass communication students in America. And you're not going to believe this, but half of them said that they didn't think there had been all that many changes in the field in the past 5 years. Who's teaching these people? I hope you are not in that half, at least not after tonight. Rather, I hope you're on the side of Isaac Newton, who said about all of his famous physics discoveries, "I seem to have been like a boy playing in the seashore and diverting myself in now and then, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before me." Somewhere in that ocean of truth is the future of news, and I wish all of you happy sailing. Thank you. Now it's question time, and as I understand it, there are people with microphones, and you can ask anything about the past, present, or future of news or journalism. And the microphones are here and somewhere. So if you raise your hand, they can find you, and nobody ever wants to ask the first question.
If you guys can, just raise your hands and we'll come to you.
And these are journalists.
You guys can come forward.
There's one.
Hello.
What's your name?
My name is AJ Vincennes. As you go forward into the future, do you worry about people focusing more on the tech and not as much on the fundamentals of good journalism and accuracy, fairness, all of that?
Well, here's the deal. The technology has driven the future of news. And if we don't engage with the technology, we're not engaging with our own futures. The fair, accurate, contextual search for truth is today what it was a century ago. Will there still be a need for journalists when all of this technology happens? Absolutely, because there are still going to be all the forces in society there are today. There's going to be a group of people who want you to think things about them that are not true, and they're going to use all the technology. There are going to be people in power abusing authority, and they're going to use all the technology. So does society need someone to provide an independent, truthful source of information so that people can decide what's going on out there in the great expanse, the great sea of data? Absolutely. All of these things that you do now become exponentially more important as the technology becomes exponentially larger. It's just that if you don't engage with the technology, you're not actually part of the future. Next.
Hi, Brandon Quester here. I'm just curious, with the way the current state of media is, we have great foundations like Knight that help fund innovative forms of journalism. Such as News 21. I don't think it's a question of the technology ahead or the availability of journalists. I think the question for us is how do we pay to produce that news as we move forward? And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about once some of these foundation monies run out and where do we go from here?
Well, there are several questions embedded in that, so let me try to parse it. Thanks for those. First of all, it took hundreds of years for the current economic models to get worked out. And so it's not going to take 10 seconds for the new economic models to just pop up. So it's going to be a process. It's going to take a while. One thing I hope the news business does not do is adopt the economic model of Silicon Valley, which is to have 5,000 companies trying to succeed and 95% of them failing. That's a great way to come up with Google or YouTube or the one thing that is the great hit, but not so good for the other 95%. The kinds of new models that are interesting now, several of them are nonprofit models. There's new kinds of nonprofit news happening around the country, places like the Texas Tribune, MinnPost, Voice of San Diego. These folks are taking in more money than they're spending. Not all of them, but a few of them. That's how you sustain yourself. Public broadcasting, whether you like it or don't, has sustained itself for 40 years. How? Based on viewers like you, based on donations. So there are economic models for nonprofit news that work. Consumer Reports, Mother Jones Magazine, public broadcasting. And we think that those are going to expand into web-based forms. So that's one type of new sustainable news. Another type is what you do here. You have 900 journalists here. You have more journalists here than any newspaper in America has. And you're sustainable. You will graduate and new people will come. And that will go on forever. And so the news that you produce could be of great value. It could be news that the commercial side doesn't want to do. And in fact, journalism schools, the better journalism schools across America, are producing more and more and stepping into that void. And then there are all kinds of what you would call, new models. There are a lot more independent one-person operations. There are a lot more journalists embedded in other types of organizations. It's the digital age. There are tons of jobs. A lot of the jobs involve telling the truth, and a lot of the jobs involve, the digital tools that you're learning here. The thing to get your head around is that they're not going to be legacy media organization jobs over time. All the things that are causing legacy media to shrink are continuing, and they're going to keep shrinking. So it's a question of learning all you can learn here about new models and new forms, entrepreneurial ideas, and of helping make your own future rather than 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, thinking that what you're doing is getting trained for a job in some kind of big company somewhere. The second part of the question was about foundation money. There are 70,000 foundations in America, and there's a saying that if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. 70,000 customized ideas of what foundations should be, 70,000 different rules about what to give and not to give to. What Knight Foundation decided to do is do R&D. We decided to try to go out further on the edge and do the things that many others don't want to do or aren't interested in doing. But there are many, many, many other foundations who come behind and support foundations like ours, and their monies are a fairly steady stream. One of the things we've done at Knight is do something called the Knight Community Information Challenge, where we match the money that community foundations give to local news and information projects. And now more than half the community foundations in the field are doing more news and information work than they did 5 years ago, and half of them say they're going to be doing more in the future. So we matched $24 million of community foundation money coming in, and this is helping bring other foundations into the field. I mean, the basic problem is obvious. You just can't have a community that functions without a decent flow of news and information. The whole society breaks down. news dries up. So it's in everybody's interest, certainly in your interest as individuals, in community foundation interests and others, to support these kinds of nonprofit efforts. And there will be new commercial models. I mean, there's Patch, which has hired 1,000 journalists. You know, there will be new models coming up, and the new commercial models will take some time to take hold. What we hope is that the nonprofit journalism that's going on now will bridge us until times that the new commercial models are happening. Yes?
You were very clear on your admonition to think crazy. Have you given much thought about how we as faculty, or these students as students, can teach and learn how to think crazy?
That's a good question. I guess if I was teaching a class, I would teach a class called The New Thing. And the class would have to figure out what the new thing is and develop a news application for the new thing, and maybe even put the new thing into practice. I guess if I were running a student, the reason I say this is that there are about 500 major capital deals a year just in the area that our foundation cares about, the intersection between cyberspace, news, and community. 500 multi-million-dollar deals being funded by venture capitalists, tons of new software every year. Who's trying out these 500 different forms of software every year? Who's figuring out whether there are news applications for these 500 different companies? That's certainly something that can happen in journalism schools. And another thing I guess I would do if I edited a student publication today is try to figure out how you create a culture of continuous change. So I guess if I were editor for a year, I would, for the first 6 months, I wouldn't be allowed to touch the news. For the first 6 months, I would develop the news applications that I would implement in my second 6 months. And then in my second 6 months, I would then put everything into effect. Meanwhile, there's somebody else spending 6 months developing news applications to come right after me. So you would start sort of revolving a constant stream of new innovations coming into student media. And there's no reason why you couldn't do that actually in commercial media in partnership with commercial media, instead of an internship where the old internship where they stick you in a corner of the newsroom until you somehow by osmosis take in the magic. Instead of that, they bring a team from a university, a team that's worked for 6 months to develop a new application. The team goes to the commercial newspaper or news organization and implements the new application, and that's the internship. The internship is how to do something brand new. And then those teams rotate. So commercial media also could have a constant stream of new innovations. So who is rewriting the ethics codes? Who is rewriting the media law? Who is developing the new business models? All these things can be done in academic settings and are in other professional settings.
Yeah, I had a couple questions. The first one was, you mentioned at the beginning of your lecture an idea about the cycles of archetypes and how it's connected to the changing of the seasons. I thought that was really interesting. If you could elaborate on that, I'd appreciate it. The second one is about the idea of, you said that we're going to have some sort of crisis with machines and sort of like a war of sorts. Do you give any credence to the idea of sort of joining with the machines and sort of sharing a sort of human knowledge? Because you were talking about downloading information, but what if you could upload information too, and there was sort of this symbiotic relationship with machines where everyone could simultaneously share information?
Yeah, one of the things you could do is just look on the web for the Singularity book that Kurzweil has written, and there's actually something called Singularity University, and this is a serious guy who's got a lot of major inventions to his name. He's not, he's not exactly unknown. His predictions are rejected by a lot of the conventional scientists who say it can't. The exponential growth of technology can't keep happening, and they say machines cannot become self-aware. And maybe they can't, maybe they can. My point is, in thinking about the future, is that if it makes sense, if you think of a future that makes sense, that's not going to be the future. The future is always radically different than what we can logically project. So, will the sci-fi future that I'm talking about happen? I don't know. But something will happen that is radically different than anything any of us can imagine. The same way that those poor people back in 1899, imagining their brick buildings and their dirigibles, would be absolutely blown away to hear about nuclear submarines, jet planes, and skyscrapers full of glass.
Eric, we're going to have time for one more question, and we're going to call on one of our international journalists who are with us for the year, one of our Humphrey Fellows, to ask a global question. So Marissa is going to. I think they all wanted to ask a question, so now we're.
Hello, I'm Lubna Benjamin from Pakistan. Thank you very much for sharing some innovations about digital media. But my question is that, coming from that region, where digital media is just turning some new phases and the people are getting access to it, it's not as usual as it is in the United States. So when I see myself as a journalist and a reporter, I think when it comes to the creativity, I still think that you really need to be creative in order to cover the story, and then in order to present it in your own manner on the television channel, or even if you want to write it for the newspaper. So what do you think about it in the future when it comes about the creativity as a journalist?
That's a great question. I think we'll have to be more creative than we are now, and I think the stakes altogether are tremendously higher. And what's going for us is the infinite depth of human curiosity. People are interested in the world around them. If they weren't, we wouldn't have suddenly become a planet of 5 billion cell phones. And so, part of the creativity is figuring out how to tell stories on those 5 billion cell phones, using the 5 billion cell phones and delivering to the 5 billion cell phones. That's going to require a great deal of creativity. The stories are still, absolutely necessary to great journalism. The problem is, or the issue is, when I was in journalism school back in the Stone Age before the World Wide Web, they told me that the story was the only thing that mattered, that nothing else mattered, that the great story would change the world and that's all you needed to do. Well, it turned out that didn't happen that way. It turned out there were some other things that were important, like whether someone would pay for the story, whether someone would read the story, whether you had the right technology to get the story to someone. So even though the stories are essential, they're insufficient by themselves. Having said that, in a world where anyone can tell stories, our own professional abilities to tell them well, to be compelling, to really be able to touch people, to move people, are going to set us apart from the average storytellers. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been a great evening.